In the scripture passage that we read earlier, and in the stories around these stones, that you will be able to connect with Bible stories and with some of the things that have happened earlier that we can remember, stories we can remember. There's lots of stories and lots of remembering. And the stones were meant to be a way of doing that remembering. Something that is an anomaly. It sticks out. And so as they were, the design, the picture at least I have in my head of the way that God set this up was when they were walking by this pile of stones, the kids would go, "There's no stones anywhere around, and there's a pile of stones here. Why? Why is there a pile of stones here? What's it mean?" And it would give the parents an opportunity to tell stories of the faith of why those stones are there. How it was that God delivered them from the Egyptians, and how God got them across the Red Sea and into the land, and how that continued. The stones piled up were a reminder. They didn't exactly say on them. There wasn't a sign that said, this is about crossing the Red Sea, or this is about crossing the Jordan River. But the stones were there to provide an opportunity to tell stories. As communities and as individuals, we do some of that same sort of stuff. We create symbols. Sometimes it's really obvious symbols of what we're pointing to, but sometimes they're not as much. And we all do it in one way or another. So, for instance, how many people here are wearing a wedding band or a wedding ring? Okay? That is one of those sorts of things that you go somewhere and you're talking to someone, you've just met them, and they go, "Oh, it's clear you're married. You can see it's a symbol, it's a sign. You're married. Tell me about your spouse. Tell me about your wife or husband." And then you can say something kind of silly, "Oh, a great person," and keep going. Or you can start telling some stories about the person that you're connected to. Or in front of the church house there's a tree, magnolia tree. It's actually not supposed to be there. It's supposed to be in front of our house, but we haven't quite got it there yet. But it was given to Susan and I when I committed to walking with you as a congregation as we try and discern what God is calling to us, what God's saying. So at some point in the future, when it's sitting in our house, a neighbor might say, "That's a really nice tree. How'd you get it?" And I can say, "Well, it was a gift. It was a gift from this church." And I can start telling stories about stuff that we've been doing together and how it's a great church. So we have these sort of ways of making symbols, making piles of rocks, but the piles of rocks aren't always piles of rocks, although sometimes they actually are. So I've got some pictures here of how we, in the world, have made some of these piles of rocks, and you should recognize many of them. Not maybe everybody, but together we should recognize most of the pictures here, or all of the pictures. That's the point, is that we'll see them. And some of them are very rock-like, the first one. So what I'm going to ask you to do is, as I show these pictures, when you recognize what they are, say it. And then together, let's do some thinking about what are the stories that these pictures are pointing to. The Vietnam War Memorial. So, how many people have seen this in real life? Okay, it's incredible because it just goes on and on and on. So what are the stories? Sorry? It's in Washington. Yep. It's in the mall in downtown Washington. What are the stories that this is pointing to? So it's got the names of all of the U.S. soldiers. Just to be clear, doesn't include everybody who was killed in Vietnam. It's just the U.S. soldiers. But even still, so what is it pointing to beyond the names? Because a list of names isn't really the point. Yeah, It points to some of the stories and some of the major strife that happened in American society at the time. Wendy?
It's the longer you walk down it as it's coming down, when you get through to the bottom, there's a physical feeling of isolation and calmness and silence. And it's the eeriest thing.
Mm-hmm.
And to be surrounded by dead people's names with that feeling, it's just unbelievable.
The feeling, when you start, I don't know how well this goes backwards. It doesn't really show here because it just looks like it's a wall, but it's actually quite low at the top, and so you're still hearing the city sounds. And as you walk down into the corner, which isn't really shown here, you're hidden from the city sounds, and it's quiet. And yet there's these names are from way over your head to way under. But so there's a strangeness to it. But what sort of stories is it pointing to? Yep. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, if you were one of the Palestinians, the Philistines, which that's the same word, you might feel differently about that pile of stones that they made beside the Jordan River than if you were the Israelites who were remembering it in a different way. And yeah, your point's well made. One of the things I think is I've heard people talk about this. A lot of people go to the Vietnam War Memorial to find the name of their brother, their father, their uncle, whatever, and it's representing memories of them as they were growing up, and then a truncated life. So it's quite powerful that way, George.
I think it also demonstrates the enormous cost in pain and suffering that this stupid war had.
Yeah. Yeah, it's the enormity of the suffering, and as we talked earlier, this is only the American soldiers who died, not the American soldiers who were maimed for life or who had mental issues for life, and none of that even talks about the Vietnamese who were civilians or soldiers who were hurt. So yeah, it speaks loudly at a number of different levels.
In conjunction with that, to me, it's such a waste of life.
Yes.
Because war has never settled in.
Yeah. And one of the things that we do well is we put up lots of stones to wars. Brandenburg Gate. So why? And this is not. It wasn't piled up. I mean, it's stones as well. It wasn't a pile of stones that was created for this, but now it carries some other symbolism. What are the stories that it now carries? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It was a sign of freedom or occupation, depending on how you saw it. Yeah. I'm not sure which side this picture was taken from, but yeah. It's East Germany. In this, I mean, this is since the wall came down, so it doesn't matter anymore. But yeah, yep, yep. Vimy Ridge. So this is a Canadian pile of stones in France. I don't know where the stones came from, but we. So what's it talking about? Yeah. And so same sort of thing in terms of the war memorial, because the fields around have got like gazillion crosses for each of the soldiers who died. So it's again talking about the many people who died and people, the stories of people. I mean, we've been reading these in the paper recently of the lives of people who what they did and what their hopes were, and then they were killed in the war. The Pioneer Tower. So what's its? I mean, it's another pile of stones, really. What's it symbolizing? What's it pointing to? What are the stories that it's identifying? Sorry? New land. Again, it probably represents different things for different people, as we've been talking about before, but yes, a new promise.
Remember, the first pioneers that came to this area and settled there.
Yeah.
And some of you would know Wayne Gingrich, who was a member here. I think he helped to build the stones.
Okay. Didn't probably have to carry them out of the river, though. Okay, this one may be a little bit tougher, but 2 weeks ago, Jerry talked about it. It's Lithuania. It's a hill of crosses in Lithuania. I've got a few more pictures than Jerry had because I was blown away by it. It's just the number of crosses. And then, okay, this to think that during the Soviet time, they bulldozed it numerous times, so that this is relatively recent, this pile of crosses.
If you don't mind me saying, I looked up here to help someone on Google, and I think it would be lovely for each of us to give us the story of those icons writing the morning. Icons. They were beautiful. The two we have here shows them on Google.
Great. Yeah, thank you. Good. Yeah. So all of these crosses were put there on this hill since since basically the end of the Soviet time, because they kept bulldozing it. And each one of those, I mean, those ones are big ones. Some of those are taller than way taller than I am, and lots of them are like this big. And there's just hordes and hordes and hordes of them, pointing to freedom. I mean, as Jerry said, the revolution in Lithuania, the Soviets basically were kicked out in a pretty much nonviolent way. The Soviets killed 14 people, but that was all. You know, and so part of that's being represented in this hill. It's also, though, that people are pointing that God was part of it. It was amazing going to churches in Lithuania, and they were full of young people. You know, which is not the story of a lot of countries in Europe, but it was, at least in the churches that I was looking at. The other interesting thing about the Hill of Crosses is that now it's a place you go to get your wedding pictures taken. I had to avoid a wedding group as they were walking through. Yeah, I think this is the one that Ruth was talking about earlier. Yes. This is actually, I think, a shot from the movie When They Shall Ask. It's when the Russian Mennonites came, or some of them came out of Russia. This is actually, it's close to Lithuania. It's in the northern part of Poland or something. But as they were able to leave, it was a sign of freedom. And the stories that got back, I doubt if it even exists anymore. I think it was recreated for the movie. But it was a real thing. And if you go to Grable, there's a great big thing. It's sculpture that looks sort of like a quilt, and this the previous picture, I think, is part of that, because it's a symbol now of the stories of oppression and escape of the Russian Mennonite peoples. Yep. Leaving Russia, escaping from Russia. At the time, it was one of the later groups who left, so it would be the 1930s, 20s, 30s. It was a gate. It was like the fence defining two countries. But once the train got through that fence, then they were free. More, because it came out in 1984, 83, just before he went to Egypt. Right? Wow. Yeah. We were in southern Manitoba when it first came out, but we couldn't afford to go because they had a live orchestra and stuff. And so the first time we saw it was in Jerusalem, which was rather interesting with some of the other stuff. It was at the MCC house. They had it on video.
That's the East Tower in Wanner Church.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, I actually haven't heard of any of the disagreements. I just am aware of the peace poll, and so what's it pointing to? Because it very much is a pile of stones in some ways. Probably not specifically to the disagreements before it was built, right?
I think it's pointing to cohesiveness that is taking place.
Mm-hmm. So I need to repeat the stuff. That's what I've been trying to do. But a sign of cohesiveness, Rebecca, a sign of how the youth were being accepted, and you said something else there too. Right, because they're all written by the youth. Some piles of stones that we make are fairly specific. They actually say what they mean, as opposed to just sort of being there. And so, but it's another way for us to point to the fact that there are some important stories in our history that in our journey with God. And clearly a sign doesn't go into all the details, and the fact that, then there wasn't Sunday school for many years, and then there was, and, some of the complexities. But that's right outside for those people who may not be aware of it. So if you didn't get a chance to read it, you can read it just out there. This is another, in a sense, a pile of stones, something that points to something much greater. Because, it's just a table, right? But it's not. In almost all churches that I've been in, except for some of the newest, most contemporary churches, there's a table at the front. Why is there a table at the front of a church? It's a communion table, but that's also a symbol. So what's behind that? Okay, that's part of the symbol. Could be, especially in some other churches, would be an altar sort of symbol. But Lord's table, but yeah, communion table. But what's behind that? Sacrifice of Jesus. In one sense, but even before that, it's more to do with the Last Supper, which doesn't make any sense until we've seen the sacrifice of Jesus as well. But it's got to do with the Last Supper and Jesus eating with the disciples and relationships. And if you take a look at scriptures, Jesus eats and breaks bread. I mean, the terminology is used in many places. It's not just around the Last Supper. But yeah. And there's candles on it. If I'm a worship leader, they're hardly ever lit because I keep forgetting. And Dennis is really good at lighting them, but he wasn't here. So, but why candles? One of the last weekends that I was in Botswana, I was leading a workshop with a bunch of evangelical mission workers who were trying to figure out something about African independent churches. And so I was trying to describe some stuff to them and explain some of it and find ways that they could connect with African independent churches, because that's who we were working with. And one of the people said, one of the things I just don't get about African independent churches is they always have candles. What is it about candles? And I'm going, the vast majority of churches in the world have candles. Of all the things he could have asked about African independent churches, candles was not the one I was expecting. But why candles? Jesus is the light of the world, come into the world to banish darkness. I mean, there's lots of symbolism around light. Pentecost, it appears in a number of different ways, yeah. And on the communion table, there is a Bible. Now, a Bible contains stories, but it's also a symbol of the stories that are contained. And that's why we have it there, as a reminder that the stories we know about God working with God's people are not, all of them aren't in the Bible, but lots of them are. And it's a great place to go to be able to understand how God is working with God's people back then and today. Oops. And finally, again, except for very contemporary churches, almost all the churches that I know have crosses somewhere. There was a church, I can remember walking into a church, a Mennonite church in the States, that didn't have a cross. I looked and looked and looked. There was not a single cross at the front, but there was a huge pipe organ. I had a conversation with one of the members about the symbolism of that. Anyway, why do so many churches have crosses? George, you pointed to it earlier, actually. Yeah. The importance of Jesus, Jesus' death, and Jesus' resurrection, not just for the church, but for us personally. Sorry, Ruth.
There's one stone that I think should have been up there.
Okay.
That is the stone that marks the original burial and worship center of this church, where it was born. There was a huge stone was placed there by the Waterloo Historical Society in 1929, and it has a brass plate that gives all the details of that.
And, you know, it was suggested to me, and I was a little bit too lazy to drive up the road. But Ruth is pointing out that one of the places that part of the roots of this church are found up on top of the hill, like, just a second, am I pointing in the right direction? Yeah, I am. Down the hill and up at the top of the hill, there's a plot of land now that is got some wonderful trees on it, but there's also a stone marker. And it was on that spot, which was the back corner of their farm, but where some of the roots of this congregation are. And so, and there are stories that are connected in with that. So we make these sort of markers in different ways, and sometimes we then forget about them. And sometimes they still remain central to us. And so I think we need to be conscious of those sort of markers that we have